the landlord's nightmare. When scamming tenants backfires. He was the slumlord who made millions by scamming desperate renters with illegal fees and uninhabitable conditions. But when he tried to evict the quiet tenant who documented everything, he discovered she was a housing attorney. What happened next destroyed his empire and sent him to prison for the biggest rental fraud in city history. Welcome back to Consequences and Co. ***, where predatory landlords always meet their match and housing scams come with the steepest price of all. I'm your host, and today we're diving into one of the most satisfying tenant revenge stories you'll ever hear. This is about Jessica Martinez, a brilliant housing attorney who went undercover as a tenant to expose the worst slumlord in Chicago. When he tried to scam and intimidate her like all his other victims, he had no idea he was about to face someone who knew every housing law in the state. Hit that like button if you've ever dealt with a terrible landlord, and let's watch one woman destroy an entire rental empire with nothing but the law. Chapter 1: The Predator's Empire. Marcus Blackwell had built his real estate empire on a simple principle. Poor people desperate for housing would accept anything, and most of them didn't know their rights well enough to fight back. Over 15 years, he'd accumulated over 200 rental properties across Chicago's low-income neighborhoods, each one a carefully designed trap for vulnerable tenants. Blackwell's system was diabolically efficient. He'd advertise apartments at below-market rates to attract desperate renters, then hit them with a maze of illegal fees once they moved in. Cleaning deposits, maintenance fees, property improvement charges, and dozens of other made-up costs that weren't mentioned in the lease. His buildings were deliberately maintained in barely habitable conditions: broken heating systems in winter, plumbing that barely worked, electrical problems that made apartments dangerous to live in. When tenants complained, Blackwell's property management company would either ignore them completely or threaten immediate eviction for creating disturbances. The genius of Blackwell's scheme was that his victims were exactly the people least able to fight back. Single mothers working multiple jobs, elderly residents on fixed incomes, immigrants who feared dealing with authorities, and young people who didn't understand their rights as tenants. When tenants couldn't pay his illegal fees, Blackwell would begin eviction proceedings immediately, knowing that most of his victims couldn't afford lawyers to challenge him in court. Those who tried to fight the evictions usually lost because they didn't understand the legal system well enough to present effective defenses. Blackwell's property management company, Elite Housing Solutions, had evicted over 800 families in the past 5 years alone. Each eviction destroyed a family's housing stability while protecting Blackwell's profits from tenants who might have learned to challenge his illegal practices. The system had made Blackwell extremely wealthy. His rental empire generated over $3 million annually in legitimate rent, plus another $1 million in fraudulent fees and charges. He lived in a mansion in Lincoln Park while his tenants struggled with broken heating and collapsing plumbing in buildings he refused to properly maintain. But Blackwell's biggest mistake was assuming that all tenants were equally powerless. When Jessica Martinez responded to one of his apartment listings, he saw just another victim to exploit. He had no idea she was about to destroy everything he'd built. Chapter 2: The Perfect Tenant. Jessica Martinez had spent 8 years as a housing attorney with Chicago Legal Aid, specializing in tenant rights and landlord abuse cases. She'd heard horror stories about Marcus Blackwell's rental empire from dozens of clients, but building a legal case against him had proven impossible. His victims were too afraid to testify, and his documentation was carefully designed to hide illegal practices. That's when Jessica decided to take an unprecedented approach. She would become one of Blackwell's tenants and document his illegal activities from the inside. Using her maiden name and hiding her legal background, Jessica applied for a studio apartment in one of Blackwell's buildings on the South Side. She presented herself as a graduate student who worked part-time and needed affordable housing, exactly the kind of vulnerable tenant Blackwell preferred to target. The apartment viewing was revealing. The property manager, a hostile woman named Sandra Pierce, showed Jessica a unit with obvious problems. Water stains on the ceiling indicating roof leaks, windows that didn't close properly, and a kitchen with barely functional appliances. The rent is $800 per month, plus first month, last month, and security deposit, Sandra announced. We also require a cleaning fee, pet deposit, even if you don't have pets, and property improvement contribution. Total move-in cost is $3,200. Jessica pretended to be surprised by the extra fees while mentally cataloging each illegal charge. Under Chicago housing law, many of these fees were prohibited, and others exceeded legal limits by hundreds of dollars. Is all this in the lease? Jessica asked innocently. Some of it, Sandra replied with a shrug. The rest is just standard policy. You can take it or leave it. We have plenty of other applicants. Jessica signed the lease and paid the illegal fees, knowing she was gathering evidence that would eventually destroy Blackwell's operation. But she also knew she needed to be a perfect tenant to avoid suspicion while she documented the full extent of his fraud. Over the following months, Jessica became exactly what Blackwell's organization preferred. A quiet, compliant tenant who paid rent on time and didn't complain about problems. But she was also secretly recording every interaction, photographing every code violation, and building the most comprehensive case of rental fraud in Chicago's legal history. If you've ever dealt with a landlord who charged bogus fees and ignored repairs, hit that like button and let me know in the comments about your worst rental experience. Make sure you're subscribed because Jessica is about to turn the tables in spectacular fashion. Chapter 3. Building the Case. Living in one of Blackwell's apartments was like attending a masterclass in tenant exploitation. Jessica documented systematic violations that would have shocked even experienced housing attorneys. The heating system failed completely during a January cold snap, leaving tenants without heat for 6 days, while Blackwell's company claimed they were waiting for parts. Jessica used a hidden camera to record Sandra Pierce telling tenants that heat wasn't guaranteed in their leases, and they should wear more layers if they were cold. The building's plumbing backed up regularly, flooding Jessica's bathroom with sewage twice in 1 month. When tenants complained, they were told that plumbing problems were acts of God, not covered under their leases, and that any cleanup would be charged to tenants as additional cleaning fees. Most shocking of all was Blackwell's treatment of tenant security deposits. Jessica discovered that he never returned deposits regardless of apartment condition, instead claiming that all departing tenants had caused damage requiring expensive repairs. The repair estimates were fake invoices from companies Blackwell controlled, allowing him to steal deposits legally. Jessica's legal training allowed her to recognize violations that other tenants missed. The lease agreements contained dozens of illegal clauses designed to intimidate tenants into waiving their rights. The fee structure violated multiple housing ordinances. The building conditions violated health and safety codes in over 40 different ways. But Jessica's most valuable evidence came from other tenants who trusted her enough to share their experiences. Mrs. Rodriguez, an elderly widow in the apartment below, had been charged $400 for carpet replacement when she moved out, despite the carpet being original to the building and unchanged after her departure. James Washington, a veteran living upstairs, had been hit with a $600 maintenance fee when his apartment's decades-old refrigerator stopped working. When he couldn't pay the fee, Blackwell's company began eviction proceedings, claiming James had damaged the appliance through misuse. Most heartbreaking was Sarah Chen, a single mother who'd been evicted after reporting that her daughter was getting sick from mold in their bedroom. Blackwell's company claimed she'd caused the mold through poor ventilation practices and charged her $1,200 in mold remediation fees before forcing her family into homelessness. Jessica realized that Blackwell's operation was far worse than anyone had suspected. This wasn't just aggressive property management. It was a systematic criminal enterprise that had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from Chicago's most vulnerable residents. After 6 months of evidence gathering, Jessica was ready to spring her trap. Chapter 4: The Eviction Notice. Jessica's opportunity came when Blackwell's company tried to implement their newest scam: a building-wide infrastructure improvement fee of $200 per month, supposedly to pay for repairs and upgrades that had been neglected for years. The fee was completely illegal under Chicago housing law, which prohibits landlords from charging tenants for improvements that should be covered by rent. But Blackwell was confident that his tenants wouldn't know their rights and would simply pay the additional money rather than face eviction. Jessica refused to pay the illegal fee and documented every step of Blackwell's response. First came threatening letters claiming the fee was mandatory for continued tenancy. Then came phone calls from Sandra Pierce warning that Jessica would be evicted if she didn't comply with building policies. Finally, Jessica received an eviction notice claiming she was in violation of her lease for failure to pay required fees and charges. The notice gave her 30 days to pay $600 in back fees plus $150 in late charges, or face immediate legal action. This was exactly what Jessica had been waiting for. Instead of paying the illegal fees like most tenants would have done, Jessica responded to the eviction notice with a motion that would shock everyone in Blackwell's organization: a federal lawsuit alleging systematic housing fraud, racketeering violations, and civil rights abuses affecting over 200 properties and thousands of tenants. The lawsuit, filed in federal court under Jessica's real name and professional credentials, revealed that the quiet graduate student in apartment 3B was actually one of Chicago's most experienced housing attorneys, and she'd spent 6 months gathering evidence that would destroy Blackwell's empire completely. But Jessica's lawsuit was just the beginning of Blackwell's nightmare. Chapter 5: The Federal Investigation. Jessica's federal lawsuit triggered an immediate investigation by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, the Illinois Attorney General's Office, and the Chicago Department of Buildings. What investigators found was a criminal enterprise that had systematically defrauded thousands of tenants over more than a decade. The evidence Jessica had gathered was devastating. Her hidden cameras had recorded Sandra Pierce and other property managers openly discussing illegal practices, including strategies for stealing security deposits and intimidating tenants who complained about building conditions. Financial records subpoenaed during the investigation revealed that Blackwell had collected over $2.3 million in illegal fees over the past 5 years alone. His companies had filed over 800 fraudulent eviction cases, many targeting tenants who tried to report building code violations or refuse illegal charges. But the most shocking discovery was Blackwell's deliberate strategy of targeting vulnerable populations who couldn't fight back effectively. Internal emails showed that Elite Housing Solutions specifically sought tenants who were recent immigrants, single parents, elderly residents, or people with limited English proficiency. One email from Blackwell to his property managers was particularly damning. Focus on applicants who won't know their rights and can't afford lawyers. Poor people are grateful for anything, and they're too scared of eviction to cause problems. That's our business model. Federal prosecutors realized they weren't dealing with aggressive property management. They were looking at a systematic criminal conspiracy that had operated like an organized crime enterprise, targeting society's most vulnerable members for financial exploitation. The investigation expanded to include IRS fraud charges when auditors discovered that Blackwell had failed to report millions in illegal fee income, evading over $400,000 in federal taxes. Bank records showed he'd used fraudulent rental income to purchase luxury properties, while his tenants lived in buildings with serious health and safety violations. This is where Blackwell's entire empire starts crumbling. If you're here for this level of landlord karma, smash that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what you think should happen to predatory property owners. Chapter 6: The Media Explosion. The story of the housing attorney who went undercover to expose Chicago's worst slumlord became front-page news across the city. Jessica's evidence provided journalists with a compelling narrative of systematic abuse and brilliant justice that captured public attention immediately. Local news stations aired footage from Jessica's hidden cameras, showing property managers openly discussing illegal practices. The contrast between Blackwell's luxury lifestyle and his tenants' living conditions created powerful visual stories that shocked viewers who'd never experienced predatory landlord practices. The Chicago Tribune's investigation revealed that city housing inspectors had filed hundreds of violation reports against Blackwell's properties, but enforcement had been nearly non-existent. Political reporters began investigating whether Blackwell's political connections had protected him from prosecution despite years of documented abuse. Most damaging to Blackwell's reputation were interviews with his former tenants, many of whom felt safe speaking publicly for the first time because Jessica's lawsuit had provided them legal protection. Their stories of stolen deposits, illegal fees, and dangerous living conditions painted a devastating picture of systematic exploitation. Sarah Chen, the single mother who'd been evicted for reporting mold, told reporters, "I thought I was the only one being treated this way. Learning that this was happening to hundreds of families makes me angry, but seeing him finally held accountable gives me hope." The media coverage attracted attention from tenant advocacy groups across the country, who recognized Jessica's undercover investigation as a groundbreaking approach to fighting housing fraud. Legal experts praised her strategy, while noting that few attorneys would have the resources or dedication to spend months living in substandard housing to gather evidence. But the media attention also revealed the full scope of Blackwell's impact on Chicago's housing crisis. Housing advocates estimated that his illegal practices had forced over 1,000 families into homelessness or overcrowded conditions, contributing significantly to the city's affordable housing shortage. The public outcry following the media coverage put enormous pressure on prosecutors to seek maximum penalties against Blackwell and his associates. Chapter 7: The Criminal Trial. Marcus Blackwell's criminal trial became one of the most closely watched housing fraud cases in Chicago's history. Federal prosecutors presented evidence of a criminal enterprise that had systematically defrauded thousands of tenants while contributing to the city's housing crisis. Jessica's undercover evidence was the prosecution's most powerful weapon. Her recordings of property managers discussing illegal practices, combined with financial records showing millions in fraudulent charges, created an ironclad case that Blackwell's defense attorneys couldn't challenge effectively. The testimony of Blackwell's victims was heartbreaking and damning. Tenant after tenant described losing homes, depleting savings, and enduring dangerous living conditions because of his illegal practices. Several families had been forced into homelessness after being hit with fraudulent fees they couldn't afford to pay. Mrs. Rodriguez testified that she'd lived without heat for 3 weeks during a brutal winter because Blackwell's company claimed heating repairs weren't their responsibility. When she'd complained, she was threatened with eviction for creating disturbances. James Washington described being charged hundreds of dollars for damages that were actually normal wear and tear, then facing eviction when he couldn't pay the fraudulent fees. "I'm a veteran who served my country," he told the jury, "but this man treated me like garbage just because I couldn't afford his illegal charges." The defense's strategy of claiming Blackwell was just an aggressive businessman fell apart when prosecutors revealed the systematic nature of his fraud. This wasn't aggressive management. It was deliberate criminal activity designed to steal money from people who couldn't fight back. Jessica's testimony was particularly compelling because she could explain both the legal violations and their impact on victims. As both a housing attorney and someone who'd experienced Blackwell's fraud directly, she could describe how his system was designed to exploit tenants' lack of legal knowledge. Mr. Blackwell created a criminal enterprise that specifically targeted vulnerable people, Jessica told the jury. He wasn't just a bad landlord. He was a predator who used people's need for housing to steal their money and destroy their lives. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Chapter 8: The Complete Destruction. Marcus Blackwell's sentencing hearing was packed with his former victims, many of whom had traveled across the city to watch the man who'd exploited them face justice. The federal judge who sentenced him made it clear that Blackwell's crimes had damaged far more than individual tenants. They'd contributed to Chicago's broader housing crisis. Mr. Blackwell operated a criminal enterprise that systematically exploited society's most vulnerable members, Judge Patricia Morrison said during sentencing. Your actions forced families into homelessness, stole money from people who could least afford to lose it, and violated the basic trust that should exist between landlords and tenants. Blackwell received 8 years in federal prison and was ordered to pay $4.7 million in restitution to his victims, the largest landlord fraud judgment in Chicago's history. His entire property portfolio was seized by federal authorities to satisfy judgment debts and back taxes. But the criminal conviction was only part of Blackwell's destruction. Jessica's federal lawsuit had triggered an avalanche of civil litigation as hundreds of former tenants sued for damages. Property management companies across the city quietly settled cases to avoid being associated with Blackwell's practices. Elite Housing Solutions, Blackwell's property management company, was dissolved and its assets distributed to victims. Sandra Pierce and other managers faced their own criminal charges for participating in the fraud scheme, with several receiving prison sentences for their roles. Most satisfying to Jessica and the other victims was the complete destruction of Blackwell's wealth and reputation. The man who'd lived in luxury while his tenants suffered in dangerous conditions lost everything: his properties, his business, his freedom, and his standing in the community. The seized properties were sold to nonprofit housing organizations committed to maintaining them as affordable housing with proper maintenance and legal practices. Many of Blackwell's former tenants were able to remain in their apartments under new management that respected their rights. This is what happens when you prey on vulnerable people. If you're loving this housing justice story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments about your experiences with terrible landlords. Chapter 9: The Lasting Impact. Jessica Martinez's undercover investigation didn't just destroy one criminal landlord. It revolutionized tenant protection efforts across Chicago and inspired similar investigations in cities nationwide. The evidence she'd gathered led to comprehensive reforms in Chicago's housing enforcement. The city created a new tenant protection unit with dedicated prosecutors and investigators focused on landlord fraud. Property managers were required to complete training on tenant rights, and violations carried much steeper penalties. Jessica's law firm, which had supported her undercover work, established a national training program teaching housing attorneys how to conduct similar investigations. Her techniques were studied by legal aid organizations across the country as a model for fighting systematic tenant exploitation. Most importantly, Jessica's work had empowered Blackwell's former victims to become advocates for other tenants facing similar abuse. Several of his former tenants had become certified tenant counselors, helping others recognize illegal practices and fight back against predatory landlords. Sarah Chen, the single mother who'd been evicted for reporting dangerous conditions, told a housing advocacy conference, "Jessica showed us that we don't have to accept abuse just because we need housing. Now I help other families understand their rights and fight for safe, legal housing." The restitution payments funded by Blackwell's seized assets allowed many of his victims to rebuild their lives. Families who'd been forced into homelessness were able to secure new housing. Tenants who'd lost savings to illegal fees could afford to pay legitimate moving costs and deposits. But Jessica's greatest satisfaction came from the transformation in how Chicago approached tenant protection. The days when landlords could exploit vulnerable tenants without consequences were ending, and other predatory property owners had taken notice. Housing is a human right, not a commodity to be exploited. Jessica told the Chicago City Council during hearings on housing reform. When we hold bad actors accountable, we protect everyone's right to safe, affordable housing. Jessica's undercover work had proven that even the most systematic criminal enterprises could be brought down by patience, intelligence, and dedication to justice. Epilogue: Justice served. 3 years after Marcus Blackwell was sentenced to federal prison, Jessica Martinez stood before the National Housing Law Conference, accepting the organization's highest honor for her groundbreaking investigation that had transformed tenant protection nationwide. Justice doesn't always come quickly, Jessica told the audience of housing attorneys, advocates, and policymakers. But when we're willing to fight for vulnerable people who can't fight for themselves, justice will eventually prevail. Blackwell was serving his sentence in federal prison, where his fellow inmates were not impressed by his crimes against poor families. Prison officials had been forced to move him to protective custody after other inmates learned about his systematic exploitation of vulnerable tenants. His former empire of rental properties was now managed by nonprofit organizations committed to providing safe, affordable housing with proper maintenance and legal practices. Tenant satisfaction surveys showed dramatic improvements in living conditions and management responsiveness. The federal restitution program had distributed over $4 million to Blackwell's victims, allowing hundreds of families to rebuild their lives after years of exploitation. Many had used the money to secure stable housing, pay for education, or start small businesses that would provide economic security. Jessica had returned to legal aid work, but now led a special task force investigating predatory landlords across Illinois. Her undercover techniques had been used successfully against rental scammers in 6 other cities, leading to dozens of additional prosecutions. The Dr. Jessica Martinez Tenant Protection Fellowship, funded by a portion of the restitution payments, provided legal aid attorneys with resources to conduct similar investigations. The program had already identified and prosecuted 12 other systematic rental fraud operations. But perhaps the most meaningful outcome was the transformation in how society viewed tenant rights. Jessica's story had inspired tenants across the country to document illegal practices, report violations, and demand the safe, legal housing they deserved. Marcus Blackwell had thought he could exploit poor people indefinitely because they lacked the power to fight back. He'd learned too late that power isn't just about money or connections. Sometimes it's about intelligence, determination, and an absolute refusal to let injustice continue unchallenged. Jessica Martinez had proven that one person with the right knowledge, careful planning, and unwavering dedication to justice could destroy an entire criminal enterprise and protect thousands of vulnerable families. The predatory landlord had become the prey, and his victims had found their voice through someone brave enough to fight for them when they couldn't fight for themselves. Thank you for watching Consequences & Co. This story of housing fraud and brilliant justice shows us that predatory landlords who exploit vulnerable tenants will always meet their match when they target the wrong person. If Jessica's undercover investigation and systematic takedown inspired you, smash that like button and let me know in the comments about your own experiences with terrible landlords. Subscribe for more incredible tales where housing scammers get destroyed and tenant rights win the day. Remember, everyone deserves safe, legal housing, and those who exploit that basic need always face the consequences of their greed. Subscribe now for more stories where the vulnerable are protected and predators get exactly what they deserve.